Welcome to our third talk of the fall quarter at the David Rumsey Map Center at Stanford Libraries. My name is Salim Mohammed, and I'm head and curator at the center. Just a bit of housekeeping to start with. I will introduce the speaker. Ana Pulido Rull will speak for about 45 minutes. Please add your questions to the question box as you think of them, but remember to be specific because Ana will answer them at the end. We will monitor chat, but if it's a question, please use the Q&A box. I expect we'll do about 15 to 20 minutes of questions and then we'll close. I also want at this moment to acknowledge the co-sponsorship, besides us putting this together, the Center for Latin American Studies at Stanford and the Native American Cultural Center. So thank you for co-sponsoring this event. And we look forward to future co-sponsorships. Now on to today's speaker. Ana Pulido Rull received her art history doctorate from Harvard University in 2012 and joined the art department of the University of Arkansas in also the same year in 2012. She is an associate professor in the department. She's a native of Mexico City. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in History from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, where she began her research on indigenous painted maps and manuscripts. Her research focuses on pre-Columbian and colonial Mexico indigenous maps, specifically those designed and used as legal evidence in colonial courts of law. In her book, she analyzes the social function of native art in colonial Mexico through the examination of a corpus of maps known as land grant maps, or mapas de Mercedes. Pulido Rull also explores how, as persuasive and rhetorical images, these maps did more than simply record the disputed territories for lawsuits. They also enabled indigenous communities and sometimes Spanish petitioners to translate their ideas about contested spaces into visual form, offered arguments defending spaces, and in some cases helped protect indigenous land against harmful requests. She is the author of Mapping Indigenous Land, Mapping Indigenous Land Grants in Colonial New Spain, which was published in May of this year from the University of Oklahoma Press. During her talk, which is based on the book, Ana Pulido Rull will narrate some of the stories she has found most remarkable and share how these maps impacted indigenous communities beyond courts of law. Her book is the result of many years studying land grant maps and their court records and honors the resourcefulness and determination of the indigenous communities of colonial Latin America. So without further ado, Ana Pulido Rull. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Salim. And thank you very much for this wonderful introduction. I will just start by asking if you can all see me and hear me well. All right.
Yes, I certainly can. I hope the others are. Yes, we're getting lots of messages.
Okay, wonderful. We've been teaching online all this semester, but I still feel it's very important to make sure that everybody can hear you and
Absolutely.
see you well. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for being here today. I am honored to present my research today here at the David Rumsey Map Center. And I want to thank Salim Mohammed, Andrea Renner, and the staff at the David Rumsey Map Center for making this possible and for inviting me to present my work here today. I am delighted to share my research on land grant maps with all of you today, and I really look forward to your questions and comments at the end of the talk. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you. And I do this every week with my students. I hope we have no technical issues. Okay, can you all see the PowerPoint. All right. Okay, so the maps that I am going to talk about today are known as land grant maps, or Mercedes de Tierra, as Salim said a moment ago. Indigenous artists from colonial Mexico created over 200 of these maps during the first century of Spanish rule, so roughly between 1536 and 1660. These maps were used as evidence in legal proceedings over land disputes. The Spanish colonial administration, including the viceroy was the representative of the Spanish king in colonial New Spain, and the Real Audiencia, or the governing body of New Spain, they specifically requested painted maps to validate the claims in these proceedings. So here you got a sample, and I'm going to show you some more. The maps are kept today at the National Archives in Mexico City, at the old Palace of Lecumberri. I spent many happy hours there, happy hours that turned into many years, going to the AGN every day to examine maps and look at court records. And these maps and case files are fascinating to me because they tell the stories of hundreds of natives and Spaniards who actively participated in the defense of their lands during the colonial period. Land grant proceedings, as I hope to show to you today, allowed individuals to request land, oppose a grant that would be damaging to them, or negotiate its terms. The most interesting element for me, however, was this use of images, in this case maps, to express ideas about a land disputes and to persuade judges with them. The design and the different uses of these maps make them very interesting objects because they are layered with different meanings. When you see them here on the screen, you see paintings, and they are works of art made by professionally trained painters, but they are also some of the earliest maps ever made of Mexico, the towns and the rural areas. And in addition to that, they are valid legal evidence in colonial lawsuits. So they have many layers of meaning. And today we are going to examine these layers a little bit. So my research on land grant maps resulted in a book that finally came out last May. It was a much needed happy note in this pandemic year. And after reading so many court records and examining maps in the archives, I realized that the maps painted for these lawsuits allowed Indigenous artists and the parties that they represented to participate in discussions regarding the land distribution in their towns. So they were implicated in the proceedings. They also enabled Indigenous communities and sometimes Spanish petitioners to translate their own ideas about the contested spaces into visual form. They offered arguments for the defense of these places and sometimes even protected land against harmful requests. J.B. Harley once said, and I quote, that all maps state an argument about the world, and they are propositional in nature. All maps employ the common devices of rhetoric, such as invocations of authority, and they appeal to a potential readership through the use of colors, decoration, typography, and others. Rhetoric may be concealed, but it is always present, for there is no description without performance. So what I want to show you today is that these maps indeed are propositional in nature, and they have their own rhetoric. I talk a lot about images because it is important to note that the commission of a painted map for a legal proceeding was not very common in 16th century Europe, even though we have some very interesting examples from Spain and from England and from France, but it was definitely not a widespread practice. On these same lines, the Spanish crown also established the land grant program in other viceroyalties of the Americas, such as Peru, Nueva Granada, and the islands of the Caribbean. But it was only in New Spain. So here you got a map of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. And it was only in New Spain where the proceedings required paintings of the contested land as part of the evidence. Each one of the case files includes a map, and this underscores the unique role of images in pre-Columbian and colonial Mexico. So what you got on the screen is my work of many years. I studied the maps in the map gallery, and then the court records are kept in a separate gallery in the archives. So you got on the left side, you have a page of one of the court records, and it is written in a 16th century script known as procedural or procesal encadenada. So in order to read them, you need to do paleography and then transcription. So that was my work for many years. And I did so because I really wanted to understand what was the interplay between images and texts, if any. So yeah, how come that maps were so widespread in New Spain? Well, it all goes back to pre-Columbian Mexico. Mesoamerica, it is important to say that before the arrival of the Spaniards in 1519, there had been in Mesoamerica, or pre-Columbian Mexico, a group of professionally trained artists that specialized in cartography and map making. According to a historian named Fernando de Alba Ixtlilxochitl, I know it's a long, difficult name, these men, and I quote, were responsible of the paintings that recorded the boundaries and limits of cities, provinces, and towns, as well as of the properties and cultivated fields of individuals, end quote. Some of these maps offered surveys of territory, indicating the extent and the measurement of each one of the fields, together with a record of the names of those who work those fields. So in cases of a land dispute, these maps were brought out as evidence in pre-Columbian courts of law. It was a pre-Columbian practice that became widespread in the colonial era. The Spaniards, as you can imagine, relied on indigenous maps for wayfinding since the early first contacts between them. 16th century chronicles tell the stories of native communities providing the conquistadors with maps that help them make their way through lands unfamiliar to them. In his Decades of the New World, for example, Angleria described a couple of maps that the emperor of the Aztecs, or Mexica, Moctezuma, gave to Hernán Cortés to show him where he could store his ships in the Gulf Coast. So in addition to that, Ixtlilxochitl again narrated how the lords of Tabasco and Chicalanco gave Hernán Cortés a map to guide him in his way from Tabasco in the Gulf of Mexico in the southeast to Honduras, modern-day Honduras. The map, and I'm quoting, included all the paths, towns, and places they would pass through, as well as the rivers they would have to cross. As you can imagine, through these early positive experiences, the Spaniards learned to trust indigenous maps, a trust that led them to rely on images for other practical matters. For example, the distribution of land and the validation of claims in legal proceedings. And most importantly, the indigenous communities of Mexico had a chance through these maps to communicate their ideas and to voice their concerns using images across language barriers and cultural differences. The first viceroy of New Spain, Antonio de Mendoza, set up a legal system designed to help the native population deal with the abuses of the Spanish conquistadors. That was a first in the Americas, setting up legal rights for indigenous people. They could now bring lawsuits to court and sometimes obtain justice. And what Mendoza did was something really interesting. He met with indigenous people twice a week in person to listen to their claims, and he tried to solve the problems on the spot, or at least as quickly as possible. And when he did, every time that he met with someone, they came carrying painted maps and painted manuscripts, and they used them to present their claims. So Mendoza not only became familiar with them, but he learned how to read them, and he validated their use in colonial courts of law. So this is how the deep-rooted practice of making maps in pre-Columbian Mexico became essential to the life in the colonial world in New Spain. So the land grant maps are only one genre out of many. I think there are over 500 different maps from different genres. So this is only one out of so many others. Okay. Land grant maps, a little bit of background. Land grants specifically. So the most common means available to Spaniards and natives for obtaining land in New Spain was to request a land grant. Petitioners started by sending a formal request to the viceroy describing the desired purpose of the grant. They could be used for agriculture, for farming, they could be used for mining, and they could be used for setting up limestone quarries, for example. If the request was approved, the viceroy would ask the local authorities of the town to start legal proceedings. It was usually the mayor or the judge who took care of this. So he would notify the community on Sunday mornings after Mass in the atriums of the different churches. The church that you see here on the screen is the Church of Cuautinchan in the state of Puebla. It's a 16th century building. The community would gather in the atrium, both natives and Spaniards, and the mayor would notify them that somebody had requested a tract of land. So then the proceedings began. The distribution of land was very, very strictly regulated because the Spanish crown was afraid, of course, rightly so, that the Spanish conquistadors would take land distribution in their own hands. And they wanted to have very strict control over land distribution. So they created this system, and the King Charles V declared in 1550 that only the viceroy and the governing body were allowed to give land deeds. So in practice, Spanish magistrates should not approve land requests that could be damaging to indigenous communities that fell on their properties or their houses. But in practice, as you can imagine, land requests that fell on indigenous properties were usually granted regardless of the damage they would bring to them. However, by designing the maps of the land, map makers and the communities they represented, they were able to participate in the discussion and communicate ideas to the audiencia, the viceroy, and the judge. And because these maps were painted for the proceedings, they were completely implicated in them. They do not offer an impartial rendering of the land, but a very subjective interpretation. Okay. This is what the instruction or acordado looks like. And this is an example from Sempoala from 1590. It's a very standard formulaic document. And what I'm going to look at the handwriting, it's very difficult to read. And what I'm going to read from you is just the part of the acordado that mentions the painting. So it says, here you go. And you will commission a painting of the town where the grant has been requested, indicating other ranches that have already been granted and which are these tracts of land and the barren lands around them, stating the distance that lies between this and the lands petitioned. Once the painting has been made, you will sign it with your name and add your judgment affirmed by an oath. And you will send it to me along with everything else so I can provide what is convenient. So this is really important because it shows you that the viceroy was expecting this painting and that it was a part of the evidence that should be taken seriously. It should be signed and it should be accompanied by an oath. All right, so in my presentation today, I am going to talk to you about the three most common scenarios that I found when I was reading the court records. First, I will examine case studies that were painted when the indigenous communities opposed a grant, which, as you can imagine, happened very frequently. Then I'm going to talk about those maps designed when the community members agreed to the grant, but negotiated its terms. And lastly, I will talk about maps created to support indigenous requests. All right. So I know that some people from the audience are from here, so I'm excited to share this map with them. On September 8, 1579, Alonso de Villanueva Cervantes, the mayor of Coatlinchan, addressed the natives and Spaniards gathered in the atrium after Mass. He read them an acordado sent by Viceroy Enriquez, notifying them that Jerónimo Treviño, a Spaniard from nearby Mexico City, had requested a land grant of 2 ranches for small farm animals on the hills of Soquiaque, which fell to the east of the town. So he read to them the acordado in this same spot. To give you a little bit of reference, this is a map of the central basin of Mexico around 1519, when the system of lakes still existed. And here you have Mexico Tenochtitlan, or Mexico City. And right across the lake is the town of Coatlinchan. There is not much left of this lake anymore. But these lands were highly coveted because they were so close to the capital of the Viceroyalty. So Treviño's petition posed a serious threat to the natives because it fell on lands they had recently secured a property title for and would bring a large number of cattle, at least 2,000 new animals, to an already overcrowded area. Most importantly, this request was part of an ongoing land distribution process that was slowly moving indigenous territories into Spanish hands. Case in point, on the following day, another Spaniard, his name was Pedro González, also from Mexico City, requested another grant for small livestock right next to Treviño, side by side. So on that same week, Coatlinchan witnessed 2 different land disputes unfold. Mayor Villanueva was in charge of conducting legal proceedings to verify if these requests were viable. He announced that he would visit these lands to carry out the mandatory boundary survey, or vista de ojos, to assess the distances between the requested sites and to make sure that they didn't impinge on existing properties. This is a photograph of the landscape. I visited Coatlinchan when I was doing my research with this very badly printed copy of the map in my hands because I wanted to examine the land as well. And Villanueva had to visit the land with all the parties involved, and those who had any concerns were welcome to join. He also summoned 10 witnesses, 5 chosen by the party desiring the grant and 5 chosen by the government. As clearly stated, he also requested a painting of the land. During this visit, the parties were able to state their arguments in favor and against the grant. The natives, it is very important to stress this, they already had a property title for these lands. They won it in another grant from the former mayor Nuño de Echave, and they claimed that there was no space available for a new ranch, and they specifically requested the mayor to keep their property separated by 2,000 steps, as was stipulated by the law, and to measure these steps. Treviño, the Spanish petitioner, had a completely different stance on the matter. He said that the natives' ranch was located at a very safe distance from the area where he intended to build his own. And he also claimed that the natives did not have any cattle in the ranch, so that the ranch was empty, and that they had rented the land to other Spaniards. So as you can see, this is really important. Both parties had a completely different take on the matter, and the mayor had to investigate who was right, who was wrong, etc. And what was interesting to me was, what do the paintings say about this? Do they express a point of view? Okay, so these are the 2 maps for the proceedings. To the left, my left, maybe your right. So here, you got the map of Coatlinchan 1. It was made for the petition of Jerónimo Treviño somewhere between September 8 and 15. And to the right, you have another map that was painted for Pedro González's petition. As you can see, just by looking at them side by side, both paintings have an almost identical layout, but the style is very different. So they were made by 2 different painters. You can tell that by the brushwork, the color palette, and the style of landscape elements. Look at the trees, for example, look at the rivers. And also, if you look at them very closely, I know it's hard on a slide, but the map on the left right here is made on European paper, and the map on the right is made on an indigenous paper known as amate or fig bark paper. The map of Coatlinchan 1 is oriented to the east, following pre-conquest conventions. On the top part of the composition right here, you see the slopes of Mount Tlaloc, and then you have the rural areas of the town, and then at the bottom of the composition, you have the town of Coatlinchan, which is depicted emblematically through the image of a church and indigenous houses. I georeferenced this map using GIS. I'm definitely not a professional by any means. I just did this to show an approximate location. So I overlaid the painting over a base map that shows the town and then added a layer that shows the topography because I wanted to show you Mount Tlaloc. So this is the mountain that is depicted on the map, and here is the town. And then here I also used a world imagery base map of Coatlinchan to show the town's orientation. So this, I flipped it, and this is the town today. And here are the slopes of Mount Tlaloc, and this is the 16th century map. All right, so as you can see, the top section of the composition shows a landscape depicted with bright washes that supplies a view of selected elements from this landscape. You can see here that there is a river split into two branches. There are two different footpaths that cross the landscape from east to west. These blue-green elevations on the left and on the right side of the composition are elevation, as if seen from above. This black line right here is a ravine. And here you have the natives' ranch on this top corner. And here you can maybe see the inscription. This is a gloss written by the mayor that says, this is where Jerónimo Treviño requests the land in a hill called Soquiaque. Okay, so pay attention to the map. And you will see that the left corner of the composition, maybe you can see it. It's visible to the naked eye, I think, but can you all see this yellow patch? So this yellow patch indicates that there is a palimpsest on the map. And usually a palimpsest on the evidence says something about the legal proceedings. So I examined the maps using infrared reflectography and ultraviolet light analysis. And the infrared photograph revealed the original drawing below the coat of yellow paint, the natives' corral. So if you look at it here, the natives' corral used to be farther, it used to be closer to the requested site. It used to be here. And then it was completely deleted and then painted over and then moved to a different location. And this suggests that sometime during the proceeding, one of the artists painted the left ranch where the ranch used to be, farther north and farther west than originally intended. So in other words, the original version of this painting presented a different view of the landscape, one that shortened the distance between the natives' ranch and the site requested, underscoring that a grant in this place was not possible because it was not the mandated distance away. Sorry, I lost my place. And in addition to the palimpsest, so you got the palimpsest, and then after the painting was completed, somebody wrote all of these glosses on the map. I translated them into English for you. But as you can see, somebody added seven glosses so that the artist decided just to depict one corral. But then the person who wrote over the map, he added what you can see here, agricultural farm units of Martin Diaz next to the ranch, plowed lands of Alonso de Barrios, plowed lands that belong to the ranch, etc. So somebody was changing the painting's narrative, changing the evidence. In addition to that, this person also wrote the word baldíos. Baldíos means vacant lands on 4 different sections of the map. The word baldíos is loaded with meaning, as you can imagine in a land dispute. Baldíos to the Spaniard meant something more akin to lands that could be categorized as vacant and thus available to Spanish intrusion. But as you can imagine, to the locals of the town, there was no such a thing as a vacant land. This was the place where the towns had their houses, their sacred spaces, their cemeteries, the places where they communicated with their ancestors, and so many other things. So that is a loaded word to add. Okay. So, although it is not possible for us to determine whether there were 7 more ranches in this area or just the one, the examination of these palimpsests highlights that both parties wanted to create a painting that supported their argument. Of course, this speaks about the importance of the painting as legal evidence. So to make it a further case, the second map of Coatlinchan was painted only a couple of days later, and it depicts exactly the same region. However, for 2 artists who were working on the same land at the same time, there are very important differences between them. So again, if you look at the top left corner of the map, we notice that the position of the 2 river branches has changed. So in the first map, in the map of Coatlinchan 1, you got river 1, river 2, and then path 1, path 2, right? And then if you look at the second map of Coatlinchan, you got 1 river, then 1 path, then the other river, and then the path. So the distances between the 2 branches of the river are different as well. Excuse me. And the cornfield that is painted here used to be in this place, the contested area. So if you notice, the area has been heavily modified. The position of the river branches used to be identical. So here you can see the original river branch, maybe. I hope that you can all see it. So the river used to be here, and then it was erased and painted on a different location. And if you look closely, here you can see maybe a red line that marks a red square. So that red square used to be the cornfield, as I told you before. We flipped the map. I was very lucky to work with Sandra Cetina Ocaña and Eumelia Hernandez from the National University of Mexico, and they helped me take these photos. So we flipped the map together, and as you can see, the cornfield used to be painted here. So it was completely erased and painted over. Okay. So once again, we come across important modifications to the map's visual discourse. When in its initial position, the cornfield indicated to the viewers that the lands were in use, right? And close to the area requested as a grant. But the new arrangement of the elements changes the map into evidence that supports the Spaniard's claim. It is possible to suggest that someone, maybe the mayor, instructed the artist to modify his painting before sending it back to the viceroy. So this is really important to the outcome of the process. And of course, the case files do not mention any of this. The case files are pretty straightforward, so we don't really know what happened during these days. We just have the maps and the palimpsests to analyze and try to figure out. Okay. Villanueva granted both tracts of land to the petitioner without taking exact measurements, and he granted them in just a couple of days. The only way for the viewer to assess the distance between properties was through the painted maps which he signed. Here is the signature. You can see Alonso de Villanueva Cervantes. And he wrote a final letter to the viceroy, and he said that even though the land requested seemed to be within the boundaries of the natives' properties, it was actually a very safe distance away. And he said, you can verify that in the map. This was very important because the Coatlinchan natives, as you know, had a property title. So the painted map and the rest of the evidence should corroborate the opposite. So as you can see here, the palimpsests on the map, how would you say that, challenge the official verdict because the original content may have been effaced, but the remaining traces remind us that the paintings once conveyed different information. All right. So the two lawsuits that I just mentioned show you that even though the Mercedes laws were an arena that allowed indigenous communities to defend their land, sometimes they were not able to keep their land, even with an official document. So now what we're going to talk about are cases that show negotiating the grant. So, sorry, here. After examining a large number of court records, it became clear to me that indigenous communities had a much better chance of protecting their land through negotiation than through opposition, even if this entailed agreeing to land requests that infringed on their properties or would bring them harm. Willingness to establish a dialogue with the petitioner and the judge could help them prevent at least part of the damage that a grant could bring, and they could preserve at least smaller tracts of land. So they would lose part of their territory, but they would be able to keep some of the areas. The case that I'm going to show you right now took place in the town of San Miguel Tepetlapa in Coatepec in the modern Estado de Mexico. So here you got a map, here's Coatepec, and we're going to talk about a town that does not exist anymore, but used to be around here. On February 1st, 1580, a Spaniard named Antonio de Quijada requested a ranch for cattle in the outskirts of the town of San Miguel Tepetlapa, between the hills of Amoltepec, this is the hill of Amoltepec, and Huapalteopan, this is the hill of Huapalteopan. This was a controversial request, as it fell on lands where a couple of native families had set up their houses and their crops of agave plants. So here what you see is, this is the town of San Miguel Tepetlapa on the bottom right corner. This is the nearby town of San Clemente, hills of Amoltepec and Huapalteopan. This is a ravine. And this is the site requested where you have the written text and these agave plants between the branches of the ravine. Okay, here are some the markings of the map. The governor and the nobles of Coatepec, led by Pedro Martin and Juan Núñez Santa Maria, made 3 different attempts to stop the grant. They used 3 different arguments and strategies. They first approached the judge Sebastián Vilena de Cárdenas right after he read the acordado after mass, and they explained that the site could not be granted to Quijada because they had already given these lands to the town's Dominican order, to the church. But that was not allowed in colonial law, so the judge did not consider this reason enough to stop the grant, and he continued with the proceedings. During the visit to the land, the natives made a second case. They said that Quijada's request fell on a place that belonged to them and was their heritage. They had already set up crops in the area next to the ravine, so here. And they dedicated to sustain the town's hospital. Not surprisingly, as in the case of Coatlinchan, the petitioner had a completely different stance on the matter, and the vicar of Coatepec, Father Ambrosio de Santa Maria, said that the natives' claims were disproportionate, as he considered that there was enough land in the area available for Quijada's petition. So as you can see here, you always have these 2 polarizing vision, and it is impossible for us to know. It is impossible for anyone to know just based on the court records. But because these 2 first attempts were not successful, a couple of days later, a couple from the town, their names were Hernán Pérez and María Pérez, they brought an official document to the judge. It was a donation letter from the former governor of Coatepec, and they confirmed that they had given the lands to Maria. So they asked the mayor to add this document to the proceedings. And even though this was the strongest piece of evidence that they had, it is very surprising that a couple of days later, the following happens. Hernán Pérez comes to the judge and he says, I, Hernán Pérez, gave you a donation letter in support of my claim for one caballería de tierra that belongs to my wife in the place named Huapalteopan. I am here to say that I have nothing to argue, and instead I ask you to do not add the donation letter to the rest of the proceedings evidence, because I know that I have little rights to these lands or none, and for this reason, the donation letter has no power and no value. You can grant these lands to Antonio Quijada because this will bring me no harm. Wow, right? It might seem surprising, and it was to me when I was reading the court cases. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It seems counterintuitive to ask for the document back, but what I think is that in those couple of days, something must have happened that made them change their mind, and I think that something could have been negotiation. And I think so because a couple of days later, the native governor of Coatepec, Don Juan Bautista, with other noble principales, came to the judge and said the following. We have realized that a grant on this area will bring us little harm, and your excellency can give the grant to Antonio Quijada, as long as, and that is the key, as long as the grant lays away from the place where we have our cultivated fields and agave plants at the bottom of the hill. And as long as the grant is issued from the path that goes from the ravine to San Clemente, Don Juan Bautista. So that is really interesting, because even though we don't know what happened during those days, it is easy to think that they probably realized that even with an official document, they would not be able to keep the land. That makes sense because, as happened in Coatlinchan, they had a document, but the document was not taken into consideration. So it's really interesting to see these negotiations that are kept, they're just kept under the ropes. And as Brian Owensby wrote in Empire of Law, despite all the writing, much remains shadowy about the encounters these records depict. One must read a case knowing that a great part of what defined the legal encounter lay beyond the record. Okay. But what was interesting to me is that just as in the Coatlinchan proceedings, the painted map seems to have formed part of the community's negotiations and was modified accordingly. So here you see another palimpsest on the map. And in this case, the artist changed the visual discourse to support the new indigenous claims. He had originally represented the natives' property by means of a combination of 3 houses and 3 agave plants. So here you can see there used to be 3 agave plants, and then underneath were 3 little houses. Those houses indicated the presence of a ranch. However, when the Perez withdrew their property title, they changed the map. So they painted, as you can see, agave plants on top of the houses. You can see the brown brush strokes. And again, another infrared reflectography shows the houses underneath the agave plants. So that is important because the natives had requested some conditions. They had requested that the new grant would not fall on the places where they had their agave plants. If you remember, at the bottom of the hill and outside the ravine, that's what they said. So this map highlights the boundaries that the natives had requested, and therefore they propose a very specific reading of the area, one that protected the community's properties. So in this case, negotiation helped, and you can see it in the painting as well. These proceedings had a very favorable outcome. The natives were able to keep their properties at least for some time. And there are many, many other cases about negotiation, but of course, I don't have time to show all of them to you. But just what I noticed is that negotiating had much better chances of success than opposing the grant. Okay, so I'm just going to rush through this one so that we can get through the Q&A. And I just wanted to say that the third most common scenario was requesting the grant. So indigenous nobles and upper class natives, such as the descendants of former rulers, the town's leading men or noble principales, had the possibility to request land grants. They were fewer in number than the Spanish counterparts, but they're very important because they usually faced no opposition at all, and they received their grants in a matter of days and very easily. So this was the only favorable scenario, and it was reserved to the nobles. This is a chart with data about the Sierra Norte de Puebla, the northern mountain range, and it shows land grants between 1521 to 1700. So as you can see, of 204 land grants, 170 were given to the Spaniards and only 34% to natives. However, this 17% is very important because many indigenous families were able to keep their lands until the 18th, 19th, and sometimes all the way to the 20th century. So I'm just going to show you very quickly a map from Pawatlan del Valle. Pawatlan del Valle was a town and municipality in Puebla, in Mexico, and Don Andrés de Arellano was the native governor or cacique of Pawatlan. He requested at least 3 different grants. Maybe he requested more. He was in a privileged position because he descended from a noble family. His mother had been the governor of Pawatlan before him. He was governor for 9 years, and he received a high salary for his services, 150 pesos a year. And Arellano also had the support of powerful encomenderos from the region, and they were present in his 3 requests. So the Spaniards respected the positions of those who descended from a noble lineage, as in the case of Arellano, and they could receive certain privileges reserved to the Spaniards, such as requesting land grants. The map that he used for the 3 proceedings is very beautiful, very elaborate. I talk about it in the book. And it offers a panoramic view of Pawatlan. If you notice, in Coatlinchan and in Huapaltopan, we only saw one town and the rural areas around it. But here you see 5 different towns. And the towns are, Pawatlan was the head town. You got San Andrés Ailla, San Miguel Tetztistacan, Santa Maria Magdalena, and San Francisco Aguazotepec. By looking at these plans, you would think that there were only 5 towns in this region, right? And that they were all relatively close to one another. However, in 1585, Pawatlan was a head town, and it had 26 subject towns. And out of these 26, you only see 4. And they are not located next to each other. They're separated by, 47 kilometers. There are 47 kilometers from Pawatlan to Aguazotepec. So here again, I use GIS very precariously. And I overlaid the map on a modern base map of Pawatlan. So what I want you to see is that there are many, many other different towns around the landscape. They are very far away from each other. And many other features from the landscape were not included in the map at all, like these 2 lakes, Tejocotal and Omiltepec, they're not there. So that just goes to show that what the artist wanted to do and what Arellano wanted to do is to show a version of the landscape that connected these 5 towns only. So there's clearly a message. There is clearly something that connects these 5 towns that does not include all the others. Does that make sense? So what I want to say to conclude, and I talk more about it in the book if you want to read it, is that it is very likely that the map maker and Arellano were referring to a political rather than a geographic location between the towns. I think I propose in the book that they only included those towns that had been ruled by Arellano's family before the conquest in pre-Columbian times, and that this map is making reference to the family's historical connection to the land, maybe in hopes to obtain a land grant. Of course, it is not possible to establish this conclusively, but I do believe that this map was effective in persuading the judges because Arellano got not 1, but 3 different, very large grants. Okay. So to conclude, I would like to say that land grant maps were part of the documents presented as evidence for supporting claims in legal proceedings. Given the unique status of images in the Viceroyalty of New Spain, they were valuable assets that made possible the discussion of ideas between people from different backgrounds. And they gave those who commissioned them an additional chance for substantiating their arguments, whether they were petitioning, opposing, or negotiating a grant. Even though artists only had a couple of days for preparing the maps, they designed complex compositions with an argument about the case that seems to have been part of a larger strategy. It was valuable, if not essential, to invest time and effort in the elaboration of this piece of evidence. And you should know that when I was doing my research, I noticed that in addition to researchers, there were many indigenous communities at the archives looking for documents and maps as well. So I got really curious. I talked to some of them, and what I learned is that the National Archives, they have the National Land Registration Office, and they offer services to indigenous communities who need maps or court records for their land dispute today in the 21st century. So they do the paleography for them. They help them find the maps, not only from the 16th century like mine, but 17th, 18th, 19th. And there is a notary public on the premises who gives them a certified copy of the map and the documents. So what I want to say is that even though it's a different arena, these maps and court records are still in use today. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to listening to your questions.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was fantastic. A fascinating talk. I think one thing you may want to do is stop sharing so they see you and in your entirety. And then I'm going to start with some questions here. Some of them are in Spanish, so I think I'll have you read those and answer them. But I'll start with the first one. This is from someone who asks, I know these maps as the Cianos, are they the same?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear those maps.
Okay, I know these maps are the Cianos, Disenos. So if you look at the Q&A box, if you click on it.
I will do. Diseños, okay.
Diseños, sorry, diseños. The first question.
By diseños, you mean designs? Yes, they are.
It's an anonymous agenda, so I can't even.
if that is a question, diseños, it could be in the 16th century sources, they refer to these paintings, to these maps as pinturas, the paintings, because the word map, as you know, has a history. It's based on an Italian word. So they were paintings, and as I mentioned in the beginning, these are maps, works of art, and legal evidence all together. So yes, they could be diseños. They could definitely be diseños.
Great, thank you. So the next two questions are from Roberto Jackson, and they are actually in Spanish. So maybe you could read them and do a rough translation for the English-speaking audience and answer them. That's
okay.
That's a second question.
I will. Greetings from Mexico City. We also have the maps of the Relaciones Geográficas, and some of them have pre-Columbian iconography that show hills. Have you found pre-Columbian iconography in the Mercedes maps? I am thinking in the map of Culhuacan and its relationship to pre-Columbian iconography in the murals of the Doctrina of Culhuacan. Absolutely, you're totally right, Roberto. I was only able to show 3 maps today, sadly, but we do have maps that are, I mean, not one, but many, many maps that show pre-Columbian iconography, glyphs, sacred spaces in the landscape, pre-Columbian designs, place names, sometimes the hills, as Roberto mentions, the hills in combination with another glyph form the place name of a town. and that place name gives the name of the town, but also is a very important identity symbol and has different layers of meaning, religious, political. So yes, Roberto, they have Pre-Columbian iconography. I'm
Great.
sorry that I was only able to show 3.
I think his next question is next.
Coatlinchan was a Franciscan doctrine. Were the friars involved in the research of the Mercedes? Well, the court's record don't say so, but we do know from other maps, like the map from Tenango, that sometimes the mendicant orders, they did join forces with indigenous communities and try to help them protect their lands. There are some cases in my research in the book that speak about the alliances between the mendicant orders and the indigenous communities. So yes, in the case of Coatlinchan, I'm not sure if they participated because there is no mention in the court records.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Andrea Brambilla asks, was the mayor always a Spaniard or of Spanish descent?
Yes, the mayor was always of Spanish descent. There were some indigenous governors through the cabildo or municipal council. So they also held power at a local level, but the mayor, the alcalde mayor or mayor, and the corregidor or judge were always Spanish.
Very good, thank you. Next question is from Claudia Veronica Medina. She asks, do you think that including maps in these legal requests are due to Mesoamerican codex tradition, since, as you said, they weren't included in other parts of the Spanish realm?
Yes. Well, they were included in. Sorry, let me collect my thoughts. They were allowed to paint the map for the proceedings, but they were also allowed to paint. And I wouldn't use the word allowed because I think indigenous communities. The reason why we have so many maps and so many manuscripts is because they never stopped painting and they never stopped expressing their ideas through painted manuscripts and maps. And they send these codices or manuscripts to Spain, sometimes to the Spanish court, asking for justice. So painted images were used in many different legal arenas. When a person died, as wills, to denounce the abuses of a Spanish conquistador. There are over 500 colonial manuscripts, so they were actively involved in. I mean, they also learned, of course, they also spoke Spanish and they wrote Spanish. But in addition to the written text, there is a whole new legal arena that is expressed completely through images, through manuscripts.
Thank you. Next question is from Nancy Martinez. Actually, she has a couple of questions. So she says, hello, thank you for your talk. I have 2 questions. What were the class backgrounds of the painters and the people who requested the land be surveyed? In Guatemala, for instance, early colonial government used the descendants of Mayan nobility as representatives for land management. So maybe you want to answer that and then we'll go to the next one.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the background was usually the nobility, the noble principales who, I think it was the entire community who participated, but the names that we have recorded, and we have a lot of names recorded from the people who participated, but I think it was mostly the nobles. And could you repeat the second part of the question? Because
yeah, so she's giving an example. She says in Guatemala, for instance, early colonial government used the descendants of Mayan nobility as representatives for land management.
Yes, exactly. So in the legal system in New Spain too, to make the system more accessible to the indigenous population in general, Antonio de Mendoza first, well, the second audiencia, and then Antonio de Mendoza, they named some noble indigenous judges as judges in colonial courts, and that made the system much more, it was easier to navigate that way. So yes, they also had indigenous representatives. it's impressive to see the level of agency and participation that indigenous communities had in New Mexico, New Mexico, in New Spain.
So, and a second question from Nancy: What do you think? What do you think may be the differences between how the native populations of the time depicted the varieties of land use and their relationships to land, and how the conquistadors and Western map makers continue to depict land use? She says perhaps they articulate differing perspectives on the relationship of humans to land. I'm curious to know what observations you've been able to make through interaction with these maps and the changes they've gone through.
Yes, that is really interesting. You are right on, Nancy. The Spaniards had a completely different understanding of land, what it meant, and how it should be distributed. And in Mesoamerica, land was classified in different categories, and it was seen in a completely different way. And this is why I have such a problem with the concept baldíos or vacant lands in the maps, because to the Spaniards, lands that were not visibly in use, like if they didn't see crops or houses, they thought the lands were vacant. But according to pre-Columbian ideology and conceptualization of the land, that land was in use. I mean, even if they were not actively growing crops, it could be land whose proceedings would be eventually destined to the support of the temple or to the support of the government. It could be sacred space on the landscape. It could be the place where they communicated with the ancestors. It could be so many different things. So when these two worlds come together, this understanding of land was a big clash. There is a great book by Amara Solari. It's called Maya Ideologies of the Sacred. And she speaks a lot about that, about when the Spaniards come to the Americas and they try to make sense of the land, they push their own ideology, but it's a great book, Amara Solari. And she speaks exactly about this, about how these two different understandings of land come together in the 16th century.
Thank you, Anna. Next question is from Elizabeth Ganson, and she asks, you mentioned that the origin of this tradition of mapping is pre-Columbian. And a lot of the iconography on the maps we have seen seems to reflect this. How, if at all, quote unquote, in brackets, did a European cartographic tradition influence the creation of these land grant maps?
That is a great question, because in the 16th century, when the Spaniards come to the Americas, the artists, the map makers are exposed to a completely new, different tradition, cartographic tradition and artistic tradition. The friars and the Spaniards who moved to the Americas, they brought with them a lot of books, a lot of prints, a lot of printed maps, a lot of paintings. And these artists who were naturally curious, they were exposed to this completely new way of depicting the world. In addition to that, there was no longer a school or a curriculum where they learned how to make maps. So these artists, they received training from their parents, their grandparents, or older artists that were trained according to the pre-Columbian artistic tradition. But at the same time, in the atriums of these churches that I showed you, the friars teach them how to paint according to European conventions. And the beauty of this is that every artist incorporated these two traditions in completely different ways. The maps, the 200 maps that I saw, are very, very different from one another, because everybody's learning how to experiment. Some people feel more attracted to the new European conventions. Some people prefer to stick more to more traditional ideas. But the way they bring everything together is very new, very fresh, and the maps show this. The maps are a very good balance of European and pre-Columbian iconography. So they saw maps, they saw images of grids and churches and cities, and they just brought them together in their paintings.
Thank you, Anna.
I have, again, because we only had 45 minutes, I only showed you a couple of maps, but they're over 200, so it's hard to give a sense of such a huge corpus in one presentation.
Next question is from Catherine Bellamy, and she asks, have you noticed any particular trends in the continuation / disappearance of indigenous styles in this corpus of maps, such as toponym glyphs, which were less likely to be understood by the Spanish?
Yes, so again, because there was not a school and there was not really, rather than a trend, I would say that there is really no chronological progression. In the beginning of the colonial period, you can find artists who have completely embraced European conventions for their maps, and at the same time, at the end of the, at the beginning of the 17th centuries, you have painters who are still doing maps that are very traditional, that they use toponyms and place names. So it was all, I would say, an individual choice, a preference of style. So you cannot really say that there is a trend, because when you look at the maps, you see that there is a lot of variety, and the variety does not really represent years or decades. I don't know if that makes sense.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Yeah. The next question is from Louise Ratcliffe. Hi, Louise. She asks, what were these maps painted on? Paper or cloth?
That's a great question. I had a lot of fun at the archives because most of the maps were painted on European paper, and they were supplied, I guess, when they were doing the proceedings, they just gave them the paper. But there are many others that were painted on indigenous made paper. The map of Coatlan Chantu, for example, was made on fig bark paper or amate. And there are others that are made on parchment, on deer skin. And there are some others, in amate paper and maguey paper. Yes. So there's a lot of, and what I want to say about this is that in addition to the paper, most of the pigments are indigenous. They were made by indigenous painters. That was a tradition that stayed alive in the 16th century. Many scholars have done analysis, not exactly on land grant maps, but on other corpus like the Relaciones Geográficas, the Beinecke map, the map of Cuauhtinchan. I'm looking at my library. And they have done studies of the pigments. So most of the pigments are local, indigenous made. The ink is European for the most part.
Thank you. Next question here is, what do we know about the artists that painted these maps?
Thank you. I devoted a section of chapter 2 to this. I try to piece together everything I could about them. One thing that I want to say is that for the most part, they never signed their work, and they are not mentioned by name on the court records. So that is in keeping with the pre-Columbian artistic tradition, where they didn't sign their work either. We do have a couple of names, but that's pretty much it. So what we know is that they were trained by the friars who came to the Americas. They were trained how to paint according to European conventions, but they also received training from older painters from the older generation. So they also learned how to paint according to Mesoamerican conventions. It was usually an elite enterprise in pre-Columbian Mexico. They went to the school, to the specialized school, sometimes to the Calmecac. They were chosen as painters from a very early age, since childhood. In Mesoamerica, they worked closely. They could be very, very specialized, because in Mesoamerica, writing was done using images. There are many, many studies about this, writing in images, writing without words. And the painters were trained not only as painters as we do today in our schools, but if they were going to paint history books, history manuscripts like Codex Nuttall, Codex Bodley, they would also receive training in history, if that makes sense. And if they were going to paint religious documents, they would work at the temple and they would receive instruction in, the different rituals, the calendar. So it was a very intense training. It was very specialized. The artists had a very high status in Mesoamerica. They could, so in the colonial period, we can see that they still have an important status because they participate actively, not only in legal proceedings, but they keep making history manuscripts and mural paintings for the convents. The friars wanted to have their convents decorated with images from the Bible and stories of the Bible. So they train artists to paint the mural cycles. So they were active in many different fields. The Spaniards admired their work very much. All the chronicles, Motolinia, the people who lived with them on a day-by-day basis, they knew that they excelled at what they did. So they were very respected. They hated the representation of pre-Columbian gods, but they respected the skills of the artists.
Okay. Thank you. The next question is from our very own Alberto Diaz Caeros. Hi, Alberto. He says, a beautiful presentation, cartography and study. Thank you. Do we know whether the selective exclusion of towns is a more generalized phenomenon? How comprehensive is the cartography we can reconstruct today? For example, drawing from the Relaciones Geográficas of the Mercedes de Tierras of the true settlement patterns in the 16th century. How much did it change after the congregaciones? Yeah.
That's a really important question because it really touches on the interests of many scholars. I would say that indigenous cartography and cartography, historical cartography, I guess cartography in general, is always a selection and a representation, as we saw with Arellano. Arellano only wanted to highlight those towns that, well, he only highlighted 5 towns out of 26. Why did he do that? He had an interest, he had a motivation. He wanted to persuade the judges of giving him the grant. So what I would say, I've been working on this semester. I was working on a different project. I was working on maps, on a map of Coatepec, 2 maps of Coatepec. One is a Relación Geográfica and the other is a land grant map. And it's really interesting because they both show the same town, but they show it in such a different way that you would think it's 2 different towns. Nothing matches. The topography, the rivers, it's a completely different place. So what I think, thinking about what Dana Lipson says in her book is that reading these maps, you don't really, how to say that, you don't really get a literal representation of a town. What you get is an interpretation of the town. So you can understand a little bit about, you can get a slight geographic record of Coatepec, but most of what you get is an interpretation, like a very personal, individual view of the region. So it's just a different way to understand cartography. I don't know if that makes sense. And I'll be happy to continue the conversation via email. Alberto, if you would like. I forgot, I had a slide with my email at the end of the presentation and I forgot to show it, but I'm happy to keep debating and talking.
Anna, I will make sure everybody who attends gets that contact information, and I'll put you in touch together so you can talk more. So that'd be great. So next question is Catherine Sloan, and she asks, even though indigenous communities produce paintings with glyphs for different purposes, with the rise of legal challenges, did a cottage industry of sorts arise of indigenous artists to produce these maps for legal purposes?
Did they what? Sorry, you broke up for a moment.
Oh, yeah. So did they, I'll just repeat the question. Even though indigenous communities produced paintings with glyphs for different purposes, with the rise of legal challenges, did a cottage industry of sorts arise of indigenous artists, together to produce these maps for legal purposes?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Kathy, because when I was reading, especially that chapter about opposition was very difficult to write, because you realize very quickly that it was very difficult for indigenous communities to protect their territories, and B, sometimes they won, like they got protection and they preserved the tract of land. But then by the end of the 16th century, in towns like Irimbo in Michoacan, if a person died, they would take out their grant away. So what I mean by this is, by the end of the 16th century, in certain towns, many indigenous communities had lost their lands completely. And they kept making maps nonetheless. And what I'm going to do is build upon, I forgot to answer one part of Alberto Diaz-Calleros' question, and so I'm going to join it to this one. At the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th, the laws change and they start to do congregaciones, as Alberto mentioned. These congregations means that the populations of different towns were regrouped, congregated in a different town, so that instead of having 5 towns with 500 people, you have a larger town and all the population congregated in them. So when the laws change, they also start to make different types of maps. They start to make maps of the congregations. So they keep making maps, it's just a different tone. And they no more Mercedes maps, but they keep painting and they keep using maps and images as legal evidence in the 17th and also in the 18th century.
Thank you.
So, yes.
The next question is, are the land grant map practices you described, are they consistent across New Spain? Were there any regional patterns?
That's an interesting question. I would say they were consistent. Mexico City didn't have land grants because the government of the city distributed the land, so there was no need for grants. The north is a completely different story. In the north, you see more Spanish-made maps than. And the Maya archives, the maps from the Yucatan Peninsula are kept in a separate archive in Yucatan, where I didn't go for my research. But yes, I would say that the laws were pretty consistent. They were broken pretty consistently too. The first ones to break the law were the people who were supposed to represent these laws, like the mayors and the judges. They frequently gave away land that they shouldn't have given away, that already belonged to someone. So they were consistent, yes, and consistently broken.
Thank you. Next question here is from Carmen Fernandez Salvador.
Hi,
and you must know him. Let's see. Thank you very much for your talk. Your discussion about palimpsest was particularly interesting. In this line, I wonder if the validity or the veracity of maps is contested by opposing parties in legal proceedings. Also, do you know of maps that served as evidence in litigation that were stolen by opposing parties?
Stolen by whom?
Opposing parties.
I don't know any cases of maps that were stolen. That would be fascinating. That would make a great read. But I do know that sometimes in very contested cases, there is a case from Calpulalpan that is about 900 pages long, and the parties just keep going on and on and on. It took over 5 years to solve. And they do mention the painting a lot. They say to the viceroy that the land is protected from my grant, as your excellency can see from the painting that I am presented. So the paintings were debated a lot. The problem is that the court records do not discuss that. So you're always trying to read between the lines and try to figure out. I'm curious about the stolen paintings. I didn't come into contact with any cases that mention stolen paintings. I'm sorry, did I forget to answer the question?
I think you did. You answered the question. I just want to mention that there are several questions, and I will continue to ask them. But I'm also making sure that people who are asking a second or third question may not end up getting answered because of time. So I want to make sure that at least the first question is answered. So just something for everyone to understand. So the next question is from Yedi Rosa. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. 3 questions. Are the artists ever named? And I think you had mentioned that they don't sign them. Does the direction of the footprints on the footpath mean anything? And then the last one is, does the concept of steps go beyond physically stepping or units of distance? Thank you.
That's really interesting. The footsteps are a topic all on their own, because in pre-Columbian manuscripts, like in Codex Nutel, in Codex Bodley, the footprints indicate not only the path, but they also indicate a trajectory, movement, direction sometimes. We got a lot of examples in old manuscripts. In these paintings, they could indicate, they definitely indicate the path, and they may show direction, but not as explicitly and as beautifully as they do on pre-Columbian manuscripts. And wait, the other part of your question was?
Let's see, I
had them here and I cannot.
Yes, the first one was about the artist's ever name. Second one about the footprints, which you just answered. And then, does the concept of steps go beyond physically stepping or units of distance?
Yes, there is. The short answer is yes. In my book, I talk about the walking of the land, because as you can imagine, the walking of the land meant something different to the Spaniards and to the indigenous communities. They both traditions had practices of walking the land, the boundaries, as a symbol of taking possession. So when they did, there was also a ritual implied and the retracing of historical memory. So if you want to read more, I discuss that in the book, the meaning of walking the boundaries, both in Spain and in pre-Columbian Mexico, because indeed it was meaningful. And in some of the maps, there is a map that I talk about in chapter 1, that it's a map that instead of images of houses or paths, all that it has are footprints. There is a rectangle made of footprints and then paths made of footprints. So it makes reference to the walking of the land. So it's a very interesting one.
Thank you, Anna. Frank Drobot asks, were similar maps and paintings done in Spain itself to resolve land grant requests?
That is great that you answer, because I kept looking for examples when I was doing my research, and I found one from Valladolid in Spain. And it is a painting that was made precisely to solve a land dispute in the early 16th century. It was not very common, but it's really interesting because it shows 3 towns, 2 of which had a land dispute over the boundaries, and they hired a professional artist from a different town to make the map, because someone had already made a map and it was not considered valid evidence because this person seemed to be very partial, very biased. So they tore this map and they commissioned a new map made by a third party. So I have it in the book too, in the conclusions, because it was not as common. It was very unusual. It also happened in England and in France, but it was not widespread like in New Spain.
Thank you. Next question is from Emily Vargas Baron. She says, excellent presentation, Ana. Have you conducted similar research in the Valley of Osaka? If so, have you seen the maps in an institute, archives, or in Zapotec village churches?
I would love to. I haven't, but that would be next on my agenda. I would love to go. And I would love to do more work on the land. So, I mean, study the maps, but I would love to go to Oaxaca. So that would be the next, once we can travel after COVID.
Next question is from Haley Woodward, and she asks, thank you for shedding light on these important documents. Do any of the land grant maps utilize pre-Hispanic toponyms / place glyphs?
Many of them do. If you could see the walls of my studio, yeah, many of them still use toponyms. The Spaniards learned the toponyms really well, and it's such an extended practice that it just continued on. So yes, many of these land grant maps do. My next presentation, I will bring more maps with toponyms. Thank you.
Okay. Sandra asks, is there a point that they stopped making maps or geographical boundaries passed, which they did not continue making maps? Let me read that again. Is there a point that they stopped making maps or geographical boundary past which they did not continue making maps?
Not really. The production slowed down in the 17th and 18th century, but there is another great book by Ethelia Ruiz Medrano, she analyzes the use of manuscripts from the 16th century all the way to the 21st. So she studies the production of documents in the 17th and the 18th century, also the 19th. So maybe they made less, but they kept making maps for sure.
Yeah, she says...
less, definitely, much less.
Just as a comment, she says, she said, I asked because I've studied land grants in New Mexico from the Spanish colonial period through the Mexican period. I have not come across maps, pinturas associated with Pueblo land grants, but there are many maps made in the mid-1700s not affiliated with land grants.
Sandra, I would love to hear more about your research. If you want to stay in touch, my email, I think it was somewhere in the flyer, but let's stay in touch, and I would love to hear more about your work.
Okay, let's see. This is an interesting one. Andrea Brambilla asks, my ancestor, Juan Antonio Brambilla, who came to New Spain in 1541, was a miner. Would these maps have played a role in his work?
Thank you so much for sharing this. This is fascinating. Definitely, there were some maps made of mining, limestone mining, but still, and they would have definitely, there was, as you can imagine, people fought a lot over mining territories. There were separate laws for minings, but yes, there were definitely. So I'm so happy that you are so familiar with your history, because that's a great historical reference. Thank you so much for sharing this.
I should mention, Anna, that the chat also gets recorded, and so I will send that to you, and then you can start.
Thank you, because I would really love to listen to everything, and I can also reply to everybody by email.
Right.
Or continue the conversation. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So next question is from Angelo Aguilar Maurer. And the question is, how successful are Indigenous land claims in the actuality? He's from UC Vancouver, and he's a student from Mexico City.
Hi, Angelo. Well, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. when I was doing my research, I spoke to some of them and they were very excited about what they found because they thought they were trying to establish, for example, there was a lake in between two towns and they wanted to see if they could find documents in the archives that would finally say that the lake had belonged to them since, I don't know, the 17th century. So when they found the document on the records, they were very, very excited. I don't know what happened afterwards. So my plan back then was when I write my second book, I'll go back to the archives and I'll figure out what is happening now. I'm not sure, but again, Etelia Ruiz Medrano's book called Mexico's Indigenous Communities, she speaks about that, and the last chapter is about the 21st century. So maybe you can find more information there.
Thank you, Ana. The next question is from Ernesto Colin, and he says, thank you so much for your brilliant work. I've studied the concept of palimpsests in physical documents and as a metaphor in many disciplines. Can you talk more about the palimpsests you have encountered in the maps? It seems like the ones you highlight are vehicles for injustice.
They are. It was very difficult to determine why these maps have palimpsests. It took me many years reading because the court records, they don't mention at all modifying the maps. So all you have to guide you are the maps themselves and the court records. So it is one of my favorite topics. And indeed, initially I had considered just writing a chapter about the palimpsests. So in pre-Columbian Mexico and in colonial Mexico, you can find a lot of palimpsests, and not all of them are related to social injustice. In fact, it was really common to rework maps. I think that the ones that I showed, they were actually modified because they were part of the proceedings. So they were modified to validate an argument. But there are many other cases where that is not the case. For example, if you read a book called Painting a Map of 16th Century Mexico City, it speaks about the Beinecke map, a painting that most likely shows Mexico City in the 16th century. And there are a lot of palimpsests, especially in the depiction of, so they show the lands of Mexico, and then there is an image of all the rulers who governed Mexico during those years. And there are a lot of palimpsests there. So there is a study about, is there a political intention in modifying this list of rulers? So that's really, if you want to read more about that topic, I think that's a great book. You can learn a lot about palimpsests there.
Great. Jim Hessinger asks, the use of standardized symbols, beet, horn, agave, is interesting. Can you please expand?
Yes. So in a nutshell, in pre-Columbian Mexico, the manuscripts that were painted were done using different pictorial conventions. And in these manuscripts, what mattered was to express the ideas very clearly. And in order for ideas to be expressed clearly, all the symbols had to be consistent. So in Mixtec manuscripts, you will never find, for example, if you see the depiction of a battle between two armies, you will never see the portrayal of two armies. You will see one person from one army, one person from the other. They're all holding weapons. They have their personal names. They may have footpaths. And this is because these manuscripts did not contain written text. So all the message was conveyed through these images. And in order for people to understand and read these images, they had to be consistent. So everybody knew what a footpath was. Everybody knew how to depict an agave plant and recognize it. Everybody knew how to record a personal name or a calendar name. So all of these conventions, they were so effective in conveying meaning that they were carried over into the colonial period.
Thank you. So the next question, I'm also interested in the answer to this one. So do you know of a specific contemporary example of these maps being used in a contemporary Indigenous land claim, and if the map helped secure a positive outcome?
Thank you. Well, as I mentioned before, I don't. That would be the second part of my research, when we can all go back to the archives, because when I was in Mexico, I just spoke to a couple of people that I met there, but that would still be part two of my research. But if you want to read more about it, I really think that Etelia Ruiz Medrano's book is a great guide, because she does speak about contemporary cases in the archives. So.
Thanks, Ana. Miguel Sanchez Araiza.
Hola, Miguel.
All these names that I cannot pronounce. Where were I think he says where, but I think he means where. Were the maps corroborated / questioned in any way by judges or majors?
Yes, absolutely. Sometimes they took them at face value, sometimes they didn't. For example, there is a manuscript called the Códice de Tepeucila. In general, the language of the Códice is respected, but when the Spaniards run into a page that shows information that they don't consider accurate, they just ripped off the page and said, okay, this, they didn't trust. For the most part, they did trust Indigenous images, but they were also sometimes critical.
Thanks. Next question is from Nicole. So Nicole asks, how does the legal framework and proceedings inform your analysis as an art historian? Mm-hmm. How do you situate your approach against other art historians who take a more formalistic approach?
Okay, thank you for your question. That's really important, because when I was first studying the maps, I try to make my research interdisciplinary. So I did study a lot. I take the legal context. I use a lot of, how do you say, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought, methodology from, legal studies and the history of law. But to go back to your point of the painting, so there is really not too much information in the court records about the painted maps or how they work in legal proceedings. So in that sense, being an art historian is really an advantage, because you know how to read images and you understand how images express many layers of meaning, important ideas, how images can be rhetorical. And my training as an art historian really helped me, because reading court records, the court records are like court records today, formulaic, they repeat the same words over and over, and you cannot really get, I could only get like piecemeal information. So I think that it was the analysis of the images what really helped me understand, figure out what was happening in the lawsuits, and also what was the role of the painted image, because it's different from the witnesses' testimonies, it's different from other parts of evidence. So I would say that my analysis is interdisciplinary, but at the center, in the core, it's art historical research, because as I said, I just spent so many months at the archives looking at paintings and thinking, how do these relate to the cases at all? What are they trying to say about the land? How is the painter conceptualizing space here? So I don't know if that answers your question.
I just want to make, there's still a lot more questions. So I just want to check in and see, maybe go for another 10 minutes. And I know you're in a different time zone, and I want to be mindful. There are still 70 people here and listening to you.
So much.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So I'm going to pick a few more questions. I apologize that I probably will not get to all of them today, but this will be recorded, and Anna will probably get a chance to look at all of them. And So I'm going to start picking off some of these questions here. So this is Sandra Matthews, and she asks, were the pinturas/maps done in triplicate? A copy for the claimant, the archives of Sevilla, and Mexico City?
No, the only copies that I know of are in the Mexican National Archives. Maybe there is a copy in some of the towns. If there are, I have never seen them. But these paintings were only in the archives, in the National Archives of Mexico. They're not in Spain that I know of. And the only thing that I would say is that all of these communities had an archive of maps, and they used model maps to make these new paintings. But no, they were not made in triplicate.
Okay, so related to that, Miguel Sanchez Araiza asks, it's connected. So was there a master map of town kept by the authorities? How was it possible to bring self-made maps to legal disputes?
That's a really interesting question. It sounds like a very, as if it was posed by a lawyer. Because no, they were not. They were, I mean, there were model maps. When you read Ixtlil Xochitl, he mentions that there were painters who, well, and if you know about maps, you know that in pre-Columbian Mexico, communities kept very, very detailed records of every single tract of land, who owned them. When that person died, they crossed out his face and they painted the new face with his personal name. So yes, there was a model plan in pre-Columbian times, but not in the colonial period. And this is why indigenous artists, when the proceedings began, they made this new painting of the map. And sometimes it was based on a model map. Sometimes it was just devised in the moment. And I mean, later on, the Spaniards made what we know today as cadastral plans. But initially, especially in the 16th century, most of the maps were made by indigenous cartographers.
This is from Lynn Brown, and she asks, to what extent were grants to indigenous claimants seen as advantageous by the Spanish government? And in what ways did the government see the grants to indigenous people as disadvantageous?
No, that is a great question, and that is what I wrote in chapter 1 of my books. Addresses this, because I speak about how is it possible that in a colonial regime, the Spanish government decides that indigenous people should, own land and be able to request land. But it was the basis of, I mean, it's a legal system that goes all the way back to the Middle Ages, to Alfonso X the Learned, because there was in the basis of Spanish law a will to protect the most vulnerable communities in the Middle Ages. Those were the poor, the sick, the elderly, the orphans, the widows. And in the 16th century, as you may or may not know, when the Spaniards arrived in the Caribbean, there was no such thing as a legal system. They killed and massacred and abused the indigenous populations of the Caribbean and the Antilles. And Spain was under fire by jurists and theologians and religious people who kept telling the Spanish court, you cannot behave like this. What I mean is that there was like a lot of internal debates and a lot of internal pressure for the Spanish court to treat the vassals better. So in the 16th century in New Spain, they tried to balance like two conflicting interests. How do we profit from the Americas, but at the same time act legally and fairly? It's very tense. This was not always in balance, but this is why they designed a legal system that protected indigenous people and allowed them to request land and defend land. The advantage was things were done legally because many people were complaining about the way indigenous people were being treated.
I'm going to combine a couple of questions, and this has to do with the paper that was used. Okay. You showed a slide of one map painted on European paper and other on Amate paper, or Amate, A-M-A-T-E. is one paper type used for a majority of paintings that you reviewed? That was, and then related to that, Michelle asks, as a paper maker, I've always been told that amate was never made from maguey, that this was a misconception by the Spaniards. Were their papers actually identified as being made from maguey? These are some really technical questions.
Yes. No, you're absolutely right. For the most part, what I found in land grant maps was European paper. And he's right, there's two different types of paper. There is amate paper and there is maguey paper. Maguey paper is made from the agave plant, and amate paper is made from the bark of a tree, the American fig tree. It is still produced today in Pawatlan and in the Sierra Norte de Puebla. I mean, you can buy it in Mexico in many different places. But you are right to make the distinction. When I was talking about it, I realized that I was mixing them up. And thank you very much for clarifying.
This should be a quick answer. Juan Aguayo asks, in the case you talk about, you mentioned Hernan Perez.
Yes.
I missed his wife's name. Can you share her name?
Yes, it's Maria. Maria Perez.
Thank you. Let's see. All right. Okay, this is from Donna Gary, and she asks, do maps or your studies in general give clues as to the apparent disappearance that I've heard? She says she's not a scholar. That I've heard that happened in the Mayan civilization. So is any connection to that?
No, not really. There's no connection.
All right. I'm going to, I think this is going to be our last question. And it says, this is from Carlos Nugent, and he says, thank you, Anna, for the illuminating talk. The person who asked about diseños, this is the one we started with, may have been thinking of the term that was used for land grant media in Alta California in the late Spanish and Mexican periods. Yeah, so their question reminded me of a strand of my own research on the ways Nuevo Mexicanos have used media to reclaim the land grants that have lost under US colonialism. Crossing this context with the one that ended your talk, I would like to hear more about the ways 20th and 21st century Indigenous communities have used the maps that you study. Have they turned to the maps to take back territories from the state and other settlers? I think you answered some of this in the case. Have they used the maps to understand past attitudes towards and ways of inhabiting environments? What other resources have you found in these archives? I mean, there's a lot of questions there, but I think it's a nice way to kind of end the talk. And so appreciate your answer.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you for clarifying what diseños was. I didn't know, so I'm going to keep my eyes open for this. Land grant media in Alta California in the late Spanish and Mexican periods. Thanks for clarifying. So what I understood about the use of these maps in 21st century, they're not really used to claim territories back from the state, but mostly these are used at a more local level between neighboring communities who fight over boundaries. Boundaries have always been, all the way from Mesopotamia, we have the first reference from a boundary dispute. They have been the most common, and the maps that are used today are usually to determine boundaries and to determine ownership of things like mountains, rivers, and that kind of thing. Not exactly against the government, but in the beginning of the 20th century, after the Mexican Revolution, yes, it was. There is a great art historian, her name is Robin Greeley, and she writes about photographs that were taken of indigenous communities, the entire community standing on their land. So instead of a painting, we got these photographs that were taken of an entire community with their dogs and their kids standing on the land. And these photographs were also used, in this case, yes, against the state to reclaim land. So Robin Greeley. And
Wonderful, wonderful. Anna, I want to thank you again for an amazing talk. There just elicited so many questions, and I apologize that we haven't been able to get to all of them. And we should probably do a little, maybe set aside a whole hour for this, just Q&A. In fact, I think we went for over an hour. So thank you for staying on. I've in the chat box where everybody is here, I have put in both the link if people were interested in the book to order. I've also given them your email address. So and so both of them, and then what I'll do is, or I should say, the center, all of us will put together the talk is recorded, so that will come, and any links that you want to share with me, go ahead and do that, and we'll put that all together. So everybody who registered and came to the talk will get all of that, and they could record this. So again, I want to thank you very much for your wonderful talk. We are what's coming down in 2021. There are several events, but we are really looking forward to an event in October of 2021, which will be the Barry Lawrence Ruhrman Conference on indigenous mapping, and so this event sort of helps us get to that trajectory. So really appreciate this opportunity to start this off, this theme, and again, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to let people know. Ordinarily, I would show this on the screen, but since we're really gotten well over time, on Friday, December 4th, Nick Canis is going to talk about mapping the heavens, celestial cartography from ancient to modern times. So that's coming. So please, you get the newsletter. See if you can come. And then I also want to let everyone know that we're having a really special event in January. Back in 2017, we had a conference here. We worked with Humanities Center, the Department of History, Karen Wagan and Caroline Mentor. They put together this wonderful conference, and a book has come out of it, and the book is Time and Maps. So, so we'll do that book launch in January, so watch out for that date. And with that, I want to wish you all a wonderful weekend, and thank you all again for coming. Take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Bye. You're more than welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.